everyone online. Welcome to our Newcastle Youth Studies Centre online series. Today we've got three speakers and the topic is maternal secrets, shame, silence and the materiality of mothering. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting or holding this here in Newcastle, which is on the traditional lands of the Awabakal and Worimi peoples. And that this land was never ceded, and I'd like to acknowledge the sovereignty of Aboriginal First Nations people in Australia and in all the places that you're joining from today, and also acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past and present and to any First Nations people who are joining us today and watching. So first off, we will start with a presentation from Giovanni Lewis, who's from the University of Newcastle here. I'll let Giovanni introduce her project, but we'll just for an overview of the sequence, we'll hear Giv first, and then we will hear from Bryony Lipton next, and then Eva Neely, and we'll wait to have all questions at the end of the session. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat as they arise for you. You don't have to wait till the end. It's good to put them in when you think of them, and then that gives a chance for the speakers and everyone else to see and think about how you're engaging too. So please do that. So we'll start off by hearing from Giv. Thanks, Giv.
Thanks, Julia. Had a few issues sharing my slides, so we're just going to make sure it's working properly before I kick off. All right, can you let me know if that's all good, Julia? Yep. All right. Great. Let me get myself set up. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. I'm a PhD candidate, third-year PhD candidate at the University of Newcastle. And my PhD is around maternal sexuality. So just to locate myself and my own positionality, I'm a sex therapist and educator. I'm a white, cisgender, currently able-bodied woman in a heterosexual relationship, and I have two children who are 4 and 7. And my interest in this area began a couple of years ago. I was working as a sex therapist in private practice, and I ended up having a lot of clients come to me who were parents of young children, or mothers of young children in particular. And they were struggling with their sexuality. And it wasn't about how often they were having or wanting to have sex necessarily, but it was more about how their internal sense of their own sexuality, their eroticism and desirability had shifted over the course of their transition to parenthood. And there isn't much research into this area, so I decided to return to study with a 2-year-old and explore it further. So my work is focused on the intersection of these two significant fields. One of those fields is matrescence, a term which is not super common, but some of you might have become slightly more familiar with it recently, as it's been added to the Oxford Dictionary recently, which was quite a win. But the term matrescence speaks to the critical rite de passage, so the rite of passage to motherhood. So similar to adolescence as a transition from childhood to adulthood, matrescence is that transition from non-motherhood to motherhood, but it is quite a transitional liminal period. It's not always clearly defined. For the purposes of my project, I am using a more clearly defined definition by Thomas, who defines it as from the perinatal period to a year postpartum. And that's sort of just to help me contain my methodology and my research to make it reasonable. And it's about the physical, hormonal, social, cultural, et cetera, reallocation of resources, including identity reformation that happens over this transition period. And then I'm interested in how this intersects with people's sexual subjectivity. And Deborah Tolman does some amazing work around this in terms of teenage girls and desire. And she speaks about how sexual subjectivity is about a person's experience of themselves as a sexual being, how they feel entitled to sexual pleasure and safety, making choices, and their identity as a sexual being. So you can see some similarities in language across those two fields. It's around sort of resources, choice, identity reformation. And these particular discussions are situated within a particular cultural moment at the intersection of a lot of reproductive politics, birth trauma inquiry, neoliberalism, and post-feminism, and that all informs this project. So what do we know about the sexuality of mothers? There are 6 million mothers in Australia who have poorer outcomes than their child-free counterparts overall when it comes to health, wealth, and happiness. And when it comes to sex, it seems. 70% of Australian women who gave birth in the previous year report sexual dissatisfaction. And for many of them, that's to a degree that could be considered a sexual dysfunction. So that would include desire, arousal, and orgasmic disorders. The most common sexual complaint is a lack of sexual desire. But the measures of this and other sexual dysfunctions are very positivist, very hetero, very penetrative focused. So most of the studies are really focusing on how often people desire penetrative sex, are having penetrative sex, are reaching orgasm from penetrative sex. And of course, this is a very small part of sexuality for most women. And it doesn't even really begin to scratch the surface in terms of things women find arousing, erotic, satisfying. So overall, penetrative sex does decline during pregnancy, particularly the first trimester and third trimester, and in the 12 months postpartum. However, this measure of penetrative sex doesn't really tell us the whole picture of what's happening to sexuality and intimacy more broadly. There are a couple of exceptions. There was a German study that asked about non-genital tenderness in the perinatal period. And they found that while, yes, penetrative activities did decline, that actually kissing and tenderness and affection persisted throughout. But how women subjectively experienced or made sense of this was not really explored in that study. And that's primarily where my inquiry sort of picks up. So I won't dwell too much on theory because I really want to center my participants' voices today, but a quick word on why these lenses matter for this work. So new materialist and posthuman feminism helps us move beyond the idea that sexuality lives in the mind or is a matter of individual choice. And it shows us that bodies, objects, spaces, affects all have agency in shaping experience. And embodiment and affect are central here. So when we talk about embodiment, we mean that the body isn't just a passive sort of casing for the mind, but it's an active site where sexuality is curated and lived and felt and enacted. And affect, the pre-conscious felt intensities like exhaustion, tenderness, being touched out, which is very common for new mums. All these things shape erotic possibility in ways that standard psych and biomedical models are not really attentive to. For new mums, the body is a site of feeding, holding, healing, and potentially desiring, and those experiences do not sit neatly separated from each other. And that's where the idea of a maternal sexual assemblage comes in. Sexuality in the perinatal period isn't just about hormones or feelings. It emerges through encounters with spaces, technologies, feeding schedules, interrupted sleep, health professionals, and a whole architecture of life. So soft infrastructures is the term I'll be using here, and that's what I'll be focusing on today, to name these often invisible structures, the routines, spaces, emotional and relational labour that quietly shape how maternal sexuality is produced and felt. So these theories and frameworks let us take seriously the material embodied conditions of mothers' erotic lives rather than reducing them to psych or biology or personal responsibility. So the main methodology for my PhD research is longitudinal interviews with first-time mothers. I interviewed them during pregnancy, in early postpartum, about 3 to 4 months postpartum, and again at approximately a year postpartum. And I'm almost through those final interviews. I've also conducted a focus group with mothers of young children, and I hope to complete another one, maybe two, before I finish my PhD. I've included some broad brushstrokes there around some of my participants, and they're surprisingly reflective of the general distribution of birth experiences and birth injuries in the general first-time mothers population. So around the amount of forceps, vacuums, cesareans, but episiotomies are actually unusually high. So they're usually about 23, 24%. So relatively high number in this group, with half of my participants having an episiotomy during birth. And that's an incision to the area between the vagina and the anus to widen the opening of the vagina for childbirth to occur. So let's look at how maternal care reorients and reshapes sexuality in the perinatal period. Soft infrastructure applied to care, which is what I want to focus on today, refers to the background scaffolding of labour, embodied knowledge, social relations, and everyday practices that make care possible. It's infrastructural because it organises flows of time, of energy, of bodies, emotions, even if it isn't formally recognised. In my particular analysis, the soft infrastructure of care gestures towards the presence and constancy of caring responsibilities that women often feel. And that acutely informs their capacity to be or feel sexual. For my participants, sexuality and intimacy were disrupted by birth and postpartum, but were sort of undergoing a continual reassembling. And that reassembling had a lot of both human and non-human participants. So these are the sub-themes we're going to focus on, and I'm going to focus on the last two for this presentation. And this list is not exhaustive, of course, but these are all considered in terms of how they impact the maternal sexual. So these are many of the objects and spaces that were discussed in my interviews with participants. That can be considered co-contributors in the assembling and moderating of sexuality. Participants spoke about feeding and monitoring technologies like baby monitors, as well as additions for facilitating postpartum sex, such as lubricant and pessaries. But for now, I want to focus on the sleeping spaces and places, so bedrooms, beds, and cots. So first, I just want to set up a bit of a sort of relational, affective environment that women spoke about in terms of these rooms and spaces, these sleeping spaces. The baby in the room was, perhaps unsurprisingly, a really significant contributor to women's proximity to feeling maternal duty. So that maternal vigilance doesn't end when women rest or have sex or even sleep, because through baby monitors, through sound, through proximity to the baby themselves, the mother's attention and readiness remains at least partially tethered to the baby, and it produces a state of vigilant rest that distracts the mother's presence. It complicates their desire. It requires active labour to carve out time and space for any erotic potential to occur. So there's two quite big quotes there, and I might just give you a moment to have a look at those. So for both of these participants, mum mode and getting in the mood, or motherhood and sexuality, were mutually exclusive and difficult to reconcile. And they were heavily influenced by the physical and mental presence of the baby. So in Z's words, women can either be a wholesome being, meaning a mother, or a sexual being. But there was a hard gear shift to move from one to the other. And for Christy, she described it as like worlds colliding. The subjectivity only exists as either mum, wholesome being, or their partner's partner and sexual being. And care and responsibility became part and parcel of both. So let's talk about the redefinition of space in the context of this soft infrastructure of care. Several participants described choosing co-sleeping or room sharing as a kind of logistical optimization of sleep, health, and mother-baby connection. The spatial arrangement of sleeping in a separate room to their partner was noted to be efficient or sensible, workable, pragmatic, prompted by intentions to sort of streamline overnight feeds and settling, and also to protect the sleep and safety of their partner, especially if their partner drove long distances for work. So the infrastructure of care here, which informs the rearranging of sleeping spaces, is not just care for the infant, where Carlin refers to, getting up and doing the feeds overnight and spoke about doing changes. And for Cassie, for example, care for their partner. So protecting their partner's sleep was a really important part of why they were redefining and reshaping sleeping spaces. But this rearrangement of sleeping spaces and furniture to facilitate such care routines reorganizes who has access to sexual agency and desire. So this quote from Alison, she talks about being sound asleep when her partner comes to bed and that they don't cuddle in bed anymore. And if we do cuddle in bed, then the baby's often there with us and it's like a nice little family cuddle. She said that she says to her partner, I miss you. I miss you. I just miss just being able to hold you and be with you for longer than just sitting on the couch together. But again, at the same time, I love that time as well. And I think he's now content with our little bubble, like our little family bubble, like he loves our morning cuddles. So these rearrangements of sleeping spaces convert what was previously couples space into family space. And that has a ricochet through erotic potential. And for Alison, there was this reclassification and desexualization of the family bed. The presence of the baby in the bed transforms it from this couples zone that it may have previously been to a shared family bubble for family cuddles. And the baby's presence reclassifies both spatial meaning of the bed as well as Alison's attention, placing her within that maternal role and excluding the possibility of entering a sexual role. So even when partners are engaged in the same physical behaviors, in this case, cuddles, that they may have previously been, that used to be intimately coded, the presence or even anticipated presence of the baby reorganizes their attention outwards, away from each other and towards the baby. And then touch, these cuddles become familial rather than sexual, with attentiveness directed towards the baby and the family unit rather than the intimate dyad of partners. And Alison seems quite aware of this as she narrates that she expresses to her partner that she misses him. Similarly, Carlin and Georgia express a desire to reconnect with the couple's space of the bed with the understanding and hope that it would facilitate a return to intimacy. So Carlin says, I miss the closeness. And I see it as something that with time, I think once we get past that 6-month mark, I think, as I said, when we go away, it's good. We share the bed and it's nice to be able to snuggle up next to him. And Georgia also talks about when he gets back from work-related travel, I'm going to try and transition back into our room now that she sleeps so well. But it's been like your housemates for a while. Really, you can't have any alone time unless I go back in there overnight. So for Georgia, returning to the bedroom was not just about opening opportunities for physical connectedness, but was an essential component to shifting their relationship back to intimacy. So talking about housemates and the requirement for alone time is really changing that is dependent on a shift back into the bedroom. For these two participants, spatial arrangements were key actors in moderating and facilitating sexuality. And Sam, at 4 months postpartum, responding to a question about what she anticipates life and intimacy to be like at 12 months, indicated that the baby being in a separate room would be a key factor in moderating sexual intimacy between her partner. The little laugh she offers acknowledges the sort of temporal swampiness she's currently in which doesn't even really afford her an image of a time where the baby's not in their bedroom. Like it's still a laughable possibility. And I think she's in this thickening of time where care routines are feeling eternal. And it informs her doubt of the possibility of the bedroom being reclaimed as a couple's space. So I'm going to quickly move on to the embodied subjective elements with the couple of minutes I have left, which similarly undergo a recalibration within maternal care routines and needs. And I'm going to focus on the meaning of the maternal body. So for many participants, pregnancy was an embodied indicator of maternal success. So Fiona says that through the last 3 weeks, and she's about 5 months pregnant here, she's had a bit of a switch where she says she wants to have the pregnant belly so she can connect with the baby. And I don't care that I've got side dish boobs now, like that's fine. I care about breastfeeding and I'd like to be able to do that. So if this is the indicator, that means that's my body's responding to those hormones and that's positive that I'm going to see it that way. Maybe it doesn't matter about the boobs. Maybe it will be nice to have like a bit of time being uncomfortable because I'm getting kicked to shit by a baby. I love this quote from her. But for her and Lilo, who talks about getting the belly and the boobs and fulfilling my destiny of finally getting into the shape of the person I've always wanted to be, the pregnant body was more about functionality and anticipation rather than aesthetic or sexuality. The pregnant body here becomes a barometer of imagined maternal success. But it is temporally agile in that it does not only apply to the current body as indicating successful pregnancy, but also future successful birth, successful lactation, successful bonding with the baby, which is all part of this embodied maternal duty in the infrastructure of care. And at the same time as the body was framed as beautiful and maternally successful, the perinatal body, particularly the postpartum body, was framed as obviously undesirable, setting up another duality of maternal versus sexual. So while pregnant, Christy expressed discomfort with how her body feels as it moves, takes up space, and is inhabited. She says feeling like a bigger person is quite different. She's not very comfortable. It doesn't feel like a sexual body, and she obviously just doesn't feel attractive anymore. So her temporary loss of sexuality to pregnancy is undermined not by appearance alone, but by a discomfort in the body's familiarity. And for Christy, bodily changes to shape and size challenge frameworks of recognizability and legibility, which impact her sexual subjectivity. Christy said that she felt invisible and not like herself when she was pregnant, and she was imagining a postpartum return to visibility and selfhood. However, as you'll notice in that second quote, she experienced a prolapse in postpartum. And her embodied experience here again was significantly disrupted and reshaped. Her sexuality is transformed and withdrawn through these acute feelings of disgust. She says, I feel disgusting. This feels disgusting to me. I found it really hard. The idea of accepting my body had changed and the idea of letting someone else in to sort of even touch me or see me. I thought it's going to be horrible for him. He's going to think it's disgusting. So from not being attractive and being unseen in pregnancy to feeling disgusting and not wanting to be seen in postpartum, Christy's trajectory reveals a deepening withdrawal from sexual subjectivity, where this leaky postpartum body becomes not just unfamiliar, but now actively repellent to the self. And the anticipated return to a recognizable body that she may have expected is deferred indefinitely by the material realities of this birth injury. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to this final point about the postpartum body as maternal sacrifice. So here the body, more bodily change is reinterpreted not as a loss, but as evidence of maternal labor, endurance, and devotion. So Christy says that she can appreciate how her body can move and the things it's done as well. the fact that she's had a human in her and she's got this amazingly healthy baby and her milk's been great and he's gaining weight. And she says, how can you expect to come away from that not having something that's a bit different? Like, how can you expect your body not to change? It's no wonder that your tissue's been stretched because you just basically were turned inside out in a 4-hour period. So her language is quite visceral. She talks about epic trauma turned inside out, and yet it's narrated with a kind of pride and adoration and wonder for her body. And Christy is who experienced the prolapse as well. So the body's capacity to grow, birth, and feed a baby reconfigures its value. Rather than being measured against this sort of pre-pregnancy aesthetic or sexual desirability, it's evaluated through the lens of what it has accomplished as a birth mother, as a breastfeeder, and as a caregiver. So this is quite a significant shift for her. But crucially, this reevaluation is grounded in maternal service, not in sexual selfhood. The body's appreciated for what it's done for the baby, not what it offers her as a desirous subject. And similarly, Becca talks about the C-section shelf being the price of giving birth. She says that the scar and shelf are a bit ugly, but tolerable because they are understood as the cost of entry into motherhood. There's this sort of quiet resignation and acceptance. The sacrifice narrative becomes or provides a socially acceptable script. But if the body is reframed as a monument to maternal labour, then reclaiming it as a site of possible pleasure, desire, or eroticism becomes much more difficult, because to do so would mean stepping outside of the very framework that has made these bodily changes bearable. So I'm going to finish there with some final sort of thoughts that there's an incompatibility of motherhood and sexuality, and it's co-constituted by places, objects, bodies, body parts, affects, and infrastructures of care. It's not just a case of being touched out or recovering from birth or just having low desire. It's simultaneously a site of profound transition and cultural surveillance. The body is reshaped by birth, breastfeeding, and care labor while subject to competing demands of maternal sacrifice and sexual desirability. And maternal sexual subjectivity is not simply diminished during matrescence, it is actively reorganized through entanglements of embodied experience, identity reformation, and sociocultural expectations of good, dutiful motherhood and maternal care. So I've gone a little bit over time, but I'm going to leave it there. And thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Jiv. It's
Thank
fantastic.
you.
We'll might just have one question now and then come back at the end. And as Steve said, yeah, it's wonderful when panelists can ask questions of each other as well, and you can do that at the end. So we've got one here, wondering if the researcher tried to find out when participants, when they were perceiving themselves as ugly or less attractive, is it from their own perspective, or were they seeing themselves from their partner's perspective?
A little bit of both. Sorry, I'm still sharing, aren't I? Let me stop sharing. A little of both. A lot of the time, women found their bodies so unfamiliar. They often talked about feeling that that they were turned inside out, and that birth had reconfigured their body in a way that became sort of grotesque to them. But also, yes, feeling undesirable to their partners and expecting, well, how could he possibly find me desirable in the shape that I'm in and the changes that have taken place?
Yeah, desire being relationally experienced through the relationship as well as through one's own sense of self. And also ask a question, you can maybe answer it briefly now and come back to it too. It's one interesting one about the future. So wondering, about their future trajectories and how they reflected on them. Did they understand these changes in relation to space, bodies, and desire, something temporary or more lasting, having more lasting transformative effects?
So interestingly, in my interviews with them during pregnancy, they talked about expecting things to return to normal. They sort of had a sense of what the future trajectory of their body would be, that pregnancy and postpartum would be this temporary departure from a familiar self. So they expected it in some
way. But then in the postpartum interviews, particularly at 3 and 4 months, but certainly still at 12 months, a lot of the women talked about feeling quite disoriented because they'd expected this return to a familiar body and a familiar self, and familiar spaces and routines and relationships, and that hadn't occurred. And so they were left with this feeling of sort of, for a lot of them, it was blaming themselves for that not having occurred, that I should have gotten back into exercise sooner, or I should have gone to see the pelvic floor health, physio, or I should really move back into our bedroom, or I should be more attentive to my partner. And so they saw these as more lasting than they'd expected, but that they had these sort of self-improvement plans to return to a familiar self. I mean, I'd love to be able to extend this inquiry longer, but the PhD will not allow that at this time. But perhaps a postdoc will allow me to sort of look at those trajectories a little more. Yeah.
Thank you for your questions, and we'll come back. So, conscious of time.
Sorry.
No, thank you. We'll move on now to Bryony Lipton's presentation. So Bryony is from the University of New South Wales, and we'll talk about the politics of pumping. So thanks, Bryony. I'll give you a 2-minute warning towards the end if you need it. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. And first, I'd like to acknowledge the Jinnabara people from the land of the Yugara Nation where I live and work outside of Brisbane, even though I work at UNSW Canberra, but yeah, I live up in Queensland. So it's not uncommon for the breast pump, new or pre-loved, to appear among gifts in a baby shower basket, tucked between blankets and onesies and board books. And it arrives as this practical gesture, but it carries more than utility, and it assumes that one is not just going to breastfeed, but they're going to express. So they're going to be caring, but also have this continuity. And also it implies a return to work and a balancing act already anticipated before the baby has even arrived. And this paper today comes from a larger project that I'm working on time and care and ambition in navigating motherhood and professional working life. And the central observation so far, as I'm squeezing it in my spare time, is that there's this collision between care and ambition, and it's not just a logistical one. It's more of a moral and emotional and existential crash going on. There's these gendered strains on time that are not simply matters of scheduling or, how can we do things more efficiently? They're structures of feeling and inequality that shape how women come to know themselves and what they can believe is possible in their life. So I'm interested in temporality, and what I mean by this is more than just clock time. I mean time as socially organized and valued and felt in the body. Mothers navigate two fundamentally incompatible kinds of time here. There's institutional time as this linear and legible time that moves forward and accumulates and can be measured and rewarded. And then there's care time, which loops and is interrupted and is recursive and resistant to the calendar. So whose time counts and who's being treated as elastic or always available? This is sort of a question around power that I'm interested in as well. So this is what I've been doing, in amongst all my other caring for my 3 children and working on other projects. And this is where the intersection of the breast pump comes in. It enters in the scene of motherhood right at the beginning, just as the maternal body is shifting, it's leaking and healing and attaching. And it comes with a set of cultural instructions, which is to be ready, be productive, and stay in the game. And it's more than just a tool. The breast pump becomes this symbol of a model of motherhood that's efficient and unflagging, but also invisible. And this small machine has such big implications. The breast pump, I want to argue, is this object lesson in what it costs to keep 2 incompatible temporalities running at once. So the breast pump is at the heart of this paradox, that maternal freedom is no longer imagined through transforming institutions or temporalities, but through adaptation, through products and apps, through technologies that promise autonomy while demanding ever greater self-regulation. The breast pump exemplifies this shift, rather than altering the structures of work time or time to care and support mothers and mothering. Women are often expected to contort their bodies and routines to keep pace. Freedom is recast as flexibility, and choice becomes part of consumer culture. The slow, messy, relational nature of infant and toddler feeding is mechanized and measured and rendered portable so that motherhood can continue uninterrupted and unseen within systems that, I argue, remain fundamentally unchanged after birth. And this critique sits alongside the acknowledgement that breast pumps can play a vital role. They enable breastfeeding when parents and infants are separated. They support premature or medically vulnerable babies and facilitate milk donation. The sharing of breast milk is such a profoundly generous act and community-minded act. And so this is not a condemnation of pumping itself, but of the cultural and institutional conditions in which pumping has become necessary. Moreover, while much of the discourse around pumping assumes a cisgender, heterosexual, biologically reproductive mother, the practice of expressing milk also has the potential to queer matrescence and mothering. In queer and trans families, the pump can be a connective device that redistributes feeding across bodies and making space for kinship formations that extend beyond biological and gendered norms. So in this way, the breast pump also challenges the idea of breastfeeding as an inherently didactic or maternal act. So I want to acknowledge this for sure, but in what follows today, I want to critique that cultural and institutional norms that privilege that heteronormative, individualized, biologically deterministic models of motherhood. And my focus is on how the breast pump becomes entangled in those systems, not to fix or reduce the meaning of mothering, but to open it up. The breast pump has existed in some form for over 2 millennia. In ancient Greece and Rome, ceramic glass vessels like the gutus and the tiralate were used to extract breast milk or elongate retracted nipples, serving as a pump and a feeding bottle. And then by the 16th century, breast pumps were recognized as medical instruments recommended to relieve engorgement or assist with latch. And then in the 19th century, breast pumps became more common in hospitals. Doctors used glass and rubber devices to relieve mastitis, support premature babies, or extract milk post-mortem. And designs increasingly focused on suction strength and sterilization, but the pump at this point remained largely clinical. Commercial pumps emerged in the post-war era amid rising ideals of domesticity and the era of scientific motherhood, where good mothering meant deferring to expert advice. And breastfeeding was increasingly medicalized, contributing to its decline and reshaping it under the authority of technocratic medical oversight. The pump's promotion was not just about health, but about surveillance and measurement and control. And then by the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the breast pump became entangled with feminist discourses of work and choice and bodily autonomy. Brands like Medela, Ameda, Avent, they marketed pumps as empowerment, return to work, stay connected, have it all, pump at all hours. So today we have these wearable pumps that are sleek, silent, Bluetooth enabled. They promise discretion and efficiency, a pump that you can wear in a boardroom and a mother that you can't even see. So I begin this exploration with a critical autoethnography to reflect on my own embodied experience of mothering and work and care, as well as some brief vignettes from my project on time and care and ambition, And it's through this object of the breast pump that I trace tensions between autonomy and obligation, intimacy and productivity, and critiquing the socio-technical systems and cultural narratives that shape motherhood and render its labour invisible. Hot, breasts like rocks, throbbing, lumps in the side boob, stiff neck, craning to see the slow drip, drip of juice. Why is it not coming out? Is it coming out? There's a warm humidity inside the pump. Milk and condensation bead along the clear plastic chamber. Medela, from the Latin, to cure, remedy, restoration. Am I meant to be restored? Am I meant to be healed? But I'm clay, soft tissue, shaped by suction, pushed into form, squished into a contorted shape on the couch, on the bed, stuffed with pillows and books, remote, water bottle, hydration. Yes, why am I so thirsty? I'm thirsty for recognition, for equality. I'm hungry for more, but this isn't it. And what if more is actually less, not fewer rights or less choice, but a moment not trapped by silicon pads and the whir chug of the machine. Whir chug, the pump sings this cyclical song. Pumping is not discreet, despite what the adverts tell you. It leaks, it drips, it interrupts, it's noisy. It requires sterilizing, labeling, counting, freezing. It requires planning around meetings, parking spots, office fridges, and USB-C adapters. It is an invisible labor that becomes visible the moment something spills, and I cry over precious spilt milk on the bench or the office floor. What I want to say is this: pumping is work. It is labor in the most literal sense, bodily, repetitive, extractive, and yet we are placated into not thinking of it as such. Silvia Federici reminds us that reproductive labor is the hidden engine of capitalism, the work of care and of bodies, of reproduction, essential to social life, remains largely unwaged and unrecognized. The breast pump, often hailed as this feminist tool, offers a pathway to inclusion, a prosthetic of post-feminist maternity, enabling women to return to work while continuing to nourish their infants. It promises parity with men, but parity on whose terms? To become equal under capitalism is to become extractable, efficient, continuous, non-disruptive. The pump bridges these two worlds, the softness of early motherhood and the hard logic of the labour market. It enables participation while extracting care. Feminist gains easily folded into productivity logics and liberal feminist models erase the embodied relationality of breastfeeding, framing it as a task to be managed rather than an ethical relation. Rather than demanding structural change like paid leave and universal childcare, we're offered products, wearable pumps, milk tracking apps, lactation coaching, market solutions for infrastructural absences. The pump becomes a device for managing maternal contradictions in private life rather than transforming the conditions that create them. We are sold the breast pump as freedom and flexibility. Lauren Blount calls this cruel optimism, that the condition in which the very things that promise to liberate us are what keep us attached to the systems that diminish us. Bernice Hausman warns against framing breastfeeding or pumping as mere personal choice, especially when that choice is structured by institutional constraint. Research by Heidi Fan and colleagues deepen this critique through their qualitative interviews with mothers who expressed milk extensively. For many, pumping offered control and security, a way to manage time and delegate feeding and contribute to breastfeeding while working, yet at the same time, features that offered control also produced strain. Mothers describe pumping as time-consuming, uncomfortable, exhausting, and emotionally isolating. Feeding became a logistical loop: pump, store, bottle feed, clean, rather than a reciprocal and embodied exchange. The very technologies designed to preserve care introduced new pressures: freezer stashes, supply anxieties, spreadsheets of milliliters. The pump becomes its own site of maternal self-surveillance. And yet for many, especially for working class mothers in essential industries, the pump made dual provision possible. In the absence of paid leave or flexibility, it allows women to feed and earn. So in this sense, pumping can be an act of care as well as an economic necessity. Indeed, one of my participants in my project, when they wrote a time diary, they wrote, "I tried all kinds of pumps. Nipple damage soon after birth made breastfeeding very painful. There was an urgency, needing to rest the nipples, but also so that they could heal. But also, as another well-meaning expert told me, I only had 24 to 48 hours to resolve this issue before my supply would start to drop if I wasn't pumping or feeding. I tried all kinds of pumps. I had hands-free ones that I stuck in my bra. They weren't as good, but I guess that's the trade-off. Also, they didn't really fit, which was very uncomfortable. Then we got another set of more standard plug-in ones. They worked better, but a pain in the ass, really, because obviously they weren't hands-free. It's being stuck attached to a pump when you're already on a fucked up newborn schedule. Then there's being paranoid about sterilizing, all these little bits of pumping infrastructure. Then triple night feeding in the early hours because your nips are recovering, but you need to maintain your supply, but you're crying because your hands are drying out and you don't know what the hell you've done. And will I ever feel the same in this body again? I hated the way that it was hard to leave the house." This maternal labour need not be cast as a burden or regression, but it can be politicised. Rather than outsourcing care or mechanising it, we might ask, how do we revalue this labour on its own terms? To become a mother is to enter a different relationship with time. Motherhood is temporal rupture. Time loops, swells, stalls. It becomes cyclical and chaotic. The breast pump is a technical intervention into this temporal messiness. It attempts to smooth maternal time to make it legible, measurable, and synchronized with the rhythms of paid work. But maternal time resists taming. It overflows with wakeful nights, mistimed naps and meetings, broken thoughts. It is a time of being out of time, as Ahmed says, and yet the demand is always to catch up. Felicity Joseph, in her work that draws on Elizabeth Groth's metaphor of the Mobius strip here, offers a compelling image of matrescence as a continuous surface with only one side. What appears separate is in fact folded together. This is the condition of the pumping mother, to be present and absent, present to the body, attuned to sensation, volume, resistance, but absent to the baby, the home, and the world. Pumping becomes a form of intimacy with oneself. It stretches connection across time and space. Something of you goes ahead without you, and gestures of care routed through machines. Acts of devotion performed in fragments, in pause, in preparation. And there are failures too, the low supply, the cracked flange, the charger left behind, the feeling of not being or giving or producing enough. So this is not a condemnation of the breast pump, but for many it's an essential, enabling, and even life-saving device. It's not the pump that has failed us, it's the system in which the pump becomes the only answer. The pump mechanizes intimate care so that the maternal body can remain productive within institutional time. And keen to hear your thoughts on, how we could, create structural change with bodily adaptation in mind as well. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Bryony. It was so interesting, fantastic work. I love the kind of theme of infrastructures that's already emerging across the presentations, and such an effective sort of way of communicating the politics of the topic, I think. Jiv has a question in the chat. She asks if you could speak a little bit more to the quantified self that might result from the practice of pumping, like the attunements to the amounts and frequency, and how this informs women's sense of maternal or feminine success, the kind of, quantity, success.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thank you. There's so much pressure to measure everything in terms of success or failure, I guess, in the same way you would at work professionally, and this where they're colliding and there's these dominant norms around what success looks like or what a successful maternal relationship to feeding might look like. And I'm keen to explore that more in I guess similarly with your work on desire, about shifting desire, but also, and for me, shifting senses of ambition, and how does mothering change that at all, and then coming to feeding, and then pumping as well as an extension of that as well, just adds a whole nother layer of challenges and ambivalences.
Do you want to speak to that, Juve, or respond?
I guess I was just interested in, a lot of my participants talked about when they started paying more attention to their bodies, for example, when they had a prolapse or they had an issue with their pelvic floor, suddenly that closer investigatory gaze on their own body produced more anxiety. And I'm interested in women's experience with pumping. Does starting pumping and starting to measure output of breast milk create more anxiety around whether you're producing enough, whether you're a successful feeder or pumper, just in terms of like suddenly having a quantifiable measure of output and what the experience of that is like for them?
Yeah, I guess the medicalization of like what's a normal amount of breast milk, that's going to vary, and it's such an individual thing. So for people to be living up to this false ideal of I need to express this much for my baby to put on weight, and it's feels like you can't win that, that's it's not fair to put that pressure on women to live up to that. But I guess that's connected to that, the medicalization of these women's health, and whose norms are what's the ideal and how it's being measured, and everyone's being set against that. It doesn't feel there's a lot of pressure, but also there's a lot of satisfaction too, like other time diaries talked about being satisfied at seeing it come out, like, wow, that's so cool, and but also feeling the pressure of it's not coming out and I'm failing and this is awful, I'm trapped on the couch and I can't hold my baby, and so I'm busy pumping. Sorry, I don't know if that answered your question very well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really great segue into the next presentation, of those it's going to be from Eva Neely talking about vulnerabilities, contagion, and the hidden emotions of motherhood, and the kind of the quiet or sort of unrecognized material experience of pumping is a really great, introduction to that broad area. So, Eva is from the Victoria University of Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I'll let you present now. Thanks, Eva. And we'll come back and hopefully the three presenters will be able to have a conversation, as well as in relation to other comments that any of the audience might have for any of the speakers. So thank you, Eva.
Awesome. Thank you, Julia. And I think you can all see my slides. And thank you for those wonderful two preceding presentations. There's so much that, connect with that notion of, I don't know, from feeling touched out and not even wanting to think about being touched by somebody else, to all the labor that comes with trying to feed your baby as well. So lots to think about, and I could probably talk to you for a long time about that. And I think there's lots of connections, which is what we've talked about before, between these different topics. And I wanted to share a little bit with you today about a small part of my project that I've been working on for a little while. But so my name's Eva and I live in Taputaranga, which is Island Bay, a suburb on the south coast of Whanganui-a-Tara in Aotearoa. So I live in the capital and work at Victoria University in the School of Health. And yeah, I've kind of shortcut a few of the background ideas to get to some of the more interesting ideas. I'm very happy to talk more at a later time and about in more depth about some of these things. Slides go from the next to the next. Yeah, we go. I want to start with these photos just as like little moments, I guess, of vulnerability that led me to feeling sort of the strongest human I was ever, I've ever felt in my life. And the births of my two daughters, which are sort of 10 and 13 years ago now, sparked a real strong desire for me to help sort of build spaces in which we all get to experience the strength, no matter on the journey, and sort of that notion of diversity in motherhood is a really, really strong one, and one that I didn't see reflected as much with the outward appearing lens on what motherhood is. I want to start with a quote from a book that lives on my bedside table. It's called An Undrowned Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals. Alexis Pauling-Gums invites us to explore the sort of subversive and transformative lessons of marine mammals. She says, I wonder what our sensitive edges have to teach us. What do our mortality and openness mean to the ecology we could surrender to together? What could enable us to live more porously, more mindful of the infinite changeability of our context, more open to each other and our own needs? And Alexis invites us to sort of step away from that harsh neoliberal edges of our own sort of subjectivities and become more acquainted with other ways of being together in this world through exploring marine mammals. And it sort of made me wonder what happens when we sort of break through those shields that we all have around us on who we are and how we present ourselves, and in what contexts and spaces do we feel comfortable to do so, who gets to be vulnerable and who doesn't get to be vulnerable, if our positionality means that not managing motherhood could mean the potential loss of a baby depending on who we are. So really thinking through the different cuts of that. The origins of the word derive from the Latin word vulnus, which expresses the capacity to be wounded and suffer, and which as living beings we all are prone to that. But I think a more productive or notion of vulnerability that I've been using is as emerging from subject relationality, and it's constitutive of our capacity for action. It's a hard term to kind of read up on, vulnerability. I found when I was like trying to read into it, a lot of the time it was more, it sort of was more often about illustrating powerlessness, and there's external pressures that sort of descend upon us. So almost like there's the structure upon the agency. And without discarding sort of the importance of that, I just wanted to really touch on the lens that I was looking at here, which is focus on the potential of that affective vulnerability that comes from the inside out, and what it does for maternal subjectivities when we can express that and bring it out. And also aiming to take vulnerability away from these dualisms that we often have in our knowledge systems, to not see vulnerability, emotion, bodily knowing, or femininity as weaker than, but as a forceful sort of mode of knowing and sharing and being together. And just inviting you to, I guess, with the words and things I'm sharing, to think about how it sort of resonates for you. How much do you share? Where do you share? Who do you share with? And how others sharing of their own vulnerabilities from within them sort of affect you. And I'm also including this wheel of emotions to sort of attune, I guess, to the whole repertoire of human emotion that we have available, and probably more than even on this wheel. And that feelings is a very human thing, but the way we sort of read, interpret, and code them is very contextual. And sometimes can feel quite restricted. When can we express them? When can't we express them? And I noticed that much of what we are supposed to feel in motherhood is restricted only to a couple of those categories. And I just wanted to invite you to notice and maybe think about, you could even note down a couple of emotions that you think represent the more external placed upon us notion of what motherhood is. And then conversely, maybe own lived experience of what it might be instead, or what it also involves alongside maybe some of these more outward appearing emotions. I also thought it was really interesting if you look at the joy area, which might be the most like immediate one we run to when we think about what's attached to mothering, that love and care are indeed in there, but also words like tender, grounded, and connected that I think attend to that diversity of what is required to feel even these emotions of, for example, love. And we'll get back to that a little bit later. Some of the key questions that drove my reading and work with my data in this project were how does vulnerability mobilize affect, and what are we expected to feel when we're seeing, reading, or telling narratives of vulnerability. And the project that I'm working with in this data and with these stories was a larger project I did over a couple of years, so similar to Jiv. I followed mothers from pregnancy through to 12 to 18 months, a couple even up to 2 years because they wanted to keep going. And I had digital diaries through WhatsApp with them. I interviewed them 4 times, and at the end did a collective art space workshop with all of them, which then resulted in an exhibition. And that photo is of me at the exhibition, and you can see some of the collages in the background there. So just a very brief context of the project. And part of my overall research approach is to think of maternal health and well-being as distributed and contingent upon a range of things, and importantly between mother and baby, examining in particular the embodied and felt dimensions of mothers, babies, and the relationality that exists between that. And really, one of the goals is to kind of draw on theory and research methods that allow to cut across and tell different stories. So really moving from this we get slightly out of kilter, but we kind of get back somewhere to how we felt, which Jiv again attended to, in a notion that we thought we might get to back to where we thought we were, but we never really get back there. And this is my much more sophisticated notion of what it's like to become a mother, that also extends way beyond 12 months. I have a teenager now and another child that's kind of feels like it's going into that area now, and certainly the parenting has not become less. It's just different now, right? So just a really mixed notion of what it even is to have this experience of birthing and then mothering children. And the other area that I probably haven't touched on out of all of these is sort of that sonic geography. So the data that I drew on to kind of explore these notions of vulnerability were all voice messages. So the mums could share anything with me, text, written text, voice messages, videos, photos, and quite a few of them were drawn to the voice messages, which, again, if you're pumping or you're breastfeeding or doing something else or walking, voice message is quite an easy thing to do. So I had quite a lot of those, and just found it really, really intriguing to listen to them in the moment and also afterwards, and what I got out of that. Not going to spend much time on this, but just a few people I've read around sonic geographies, different notions of what sound can do, how sound and the everyday is really entwined with different notions of powers and technology in the body, who sort of can speak and listen, again, sort of attending to the political notion there, and just thinking about the real procedural nature of voices and when they appear. And paired with vulnerability, I guess, a real notion of the voice and what the voice carries in those moments, so real sort of being quite exposed. A real relational openness, you're really in the moment sharing something that you're then straight away going to send, and so it kind of is quite emergent and evolving. Again, the temporal aspect is really interesting because it is quite in the moment, and it can kind of be quite a fleeting thought that then you come back to later and you're like, was this right or not? And so really in the moment kind of exposure, really exposing kind of, because the body often spoke quite a lot in these voice messages. It kind of came out, there were lots of tears and breaking up and all sorts of other things that were going on. So that was really interesting in these voice messages, and then sort of an unequal. So really listening for who shared what and who didn't share anything, and vice versa. So just a few different attentions, and I think noticings in that space. Sorry, that was just a really quick rundown of some of the ways in which I've engaged with those voice messages. And through doing a lot of that, and so my analysis of this, like the project has ended, but a lot of it kind of came out, and I did a lot of note taking while I was in this process of doing these diaries with the mums, and the way in which I responded and attended to the messages that they sent me. Kind of emerging from that were 4 different notions of vulnerability that I noticed in their voice messages and in the way in which they shared things with me. And a couple of these also came out through narration in the interviews that they talked to me about. And so I've got a few key points on each of these notions of vulnerability with a poem made up of the participants' words following that. So the first notion attends to vulnerability as a generative connector. And the way in which I kind of think of this is almost being akin to an ontological condition that exposes sort of the interdependencies that we have, even if we sometimes pretend that they don't exist. And it speaks to our bodies as being sort of exposed and really dependent on one another. I've got a little shortcut term to kind of capture each one, so it kind of can stick a little bit in your mind. And the one for this one is kind of we feel the same things, and so exposing that vulnerability attaches to another person because it connects with what I have experienced. And I was talking about how much like blah 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 sucks, and I like have anxiety to go to sleep because I know I'm just going to get woken up again in like 20 minutes. And then all of a sudden, all the other moms go, oh my God, crazy. Yeah, it's like icebreaker. Cool. It's giving people permission to make things less scary. And it's like I'm not going to judge you because I also felt these things. And like, I think saying those like horrible things out loud, like, I think I made an awful mistake. It takes away its power because it's not just like bumping around in your brain anymore, growing bigger and bigger each time you think about it. And you have that shame around it and tells other people it's okay and feel and say those things too. And when everyone is going, oh my God, yeah, I felt that way too, then suddenly nobody's ashamed because it's like, oh, wait, we were all doing it. Just none of us talked about it. That's silly, you know? And it's like, oh, okay, well, no, none of us get to feel shame anymore because if everyone's doing it, then it's fine. Like, then it must be normal. The second notion of vulnerability came out kind of as almost like an effective release. So a notion of like letting it out. And it's almost like that balloon, you know, that's going bigger and bigger and bigger and like hopefully not going to pop. And the sharing of it helped it deflate again a little bit. And that shortcut of thinking about that was this idea of sort of it helps evaporate and it sticks differently. It also makes it attaches differently, kind of attending to Sarah Metz's work around sticky emotions and the way in which we are supposed to feel, for example, around happiness or love, that are often the okay feelings to feel as a mother, and how that sharing really reformulated those scripts of what is okay and how is it okay to feel as a mother. And I was like, there are people out there who are like, oh my God, the newborn face is so magical. It's so special. Oh, the newborn scrunch, the newborn smell, like, oh my God, I just love my newborn. And I never felt that. Like I always loved Miles, always. But I didn't freaking like him for some of the time, you know, like, sorry, dude, but I didn't. And Ellie was like, yeah, that's exactly how I feel. Like, I don't like her. A lot of the time when I hear her start to squawk or wrestle or anything, I'm just like, oh my God, I just don't want to be around her right now. I just don't want to deal with that right now. And like, I don't know. I feel like me having permission to say those things into a phone where it's just like nebulous and like no one's going to judge me for it, then gave me permission to tell someone else, hey, you can say it's shit. Like, you can say it sucks. The third one I thought of as sort of a form of relational porosity. So somewhat this journey of birthing and growing and birthing and feeding a human almost like opening up more pores and sensing and feeling the world in a more intense kind of way. And thinking of that as like I feel others and the world more intensely, and growing sort of a care with that world in which I am living, and sort of really developing this outward facing care with one another. I think the other thing that I've noticed recently is just that everything feels so much more emotionally intense since becoming a mother, both the good and the bad. I just feel so much more sensitive to everything, even things which would normally make me roll my eyes, like social media posts being like, to the mama holding her baby while reading this, etc., really catch me off guard with how strong an emotional reaction they elicit in me. My last notion of vulnerability is sort of accumulation of the different forces and currents that I've just shared, and sort of attends to that affirmative, creative, and collective potential of vulnerability that can come through that sharing of vulnerability. And it kind of seeks to unsettle that unified human identity notion that we have, and really embrace a much more messy, incomplete, and ever-changing subjectivity that we all sort of live throughout our lives, and attends to the dependence on each other in sort of really human and more than human ways. And really attend to that transformative power, vulnerability that can create solidarity with each other. So thinking about collective strength and shared vulnerability. Oh my God, crazy. Icebreaker. Giving permission makes things less scary. I'm not going to judge you. I also felt these things. Takes away its power. Suddenly, nobody's ashamed. Everyone's doing it. It's so special. Having permission to say those things, no one's going to judge me for it. You can say it's shit, but you can say it sucks. Both the good and the bad. I just feel strong. Me, us. So I've worked through some of the notions of vulnerability in those in 4 different ways, and I have a messed up order there. Apologies. But notions around feeling the same things, how it evaporates and creates different stickiness, how I feel can feel the world more intensely through that experience, and then the sharing of that and how it might pour out of me more easily, and then through that generating some of that strength and solidarity, and maybe turning this thing that's supposed to make us more vulnerable into a strength, into a resistance, into reclaiming that, the breast pump can be liberatory, but it can also keep us tied to things in a way we don't want to, or in ways we should be feeling, but we feel differently. We should not be desiring sexual subjects as mothers, uncovering some of those kinds of things. So really just thinking about how vulnerability as a sort of superpower could, create different ways of sharing and being with one another as new mothers, really rewriting new emotional scripts that sit in between, that can be troubled, that sit between the good and the bad and are not just all rosy, and sort of attending to those hard to name emotions as well. But with that, really attending to that politics and intersectionality that sits within all these spaces, acknowledging the diverse experiences that there are, and really making space for those who maybe can't or feel worried about sharing those vulnerabilities. And I just wanted to end with an emotion wheel to reflect on sort of the idealized and lived emotions of motherhood and all the feelings that have no words, the ones that kind of are fleeting and deep. To become a mother is sort of a really deeply felt endeavor, and opens up the full spectrum of all the emotions. I'm sure many of you have felt that. And I think that living together with and in vulnerability can give rise and warrant more of these feelings, and show that all of these feelings are part of what it means to become a mother, alongside the love and the care that we all feel, but not all of the time, and certainly not just that. And airing that emotion has potential to sort of collectivize and mobilize a full spectrum of emotions for mothers and parents. And yeah, just finishing off with a beautiful quote from Bell Hooks. and my children when they were still much smaller than they are now. And hopefully that was about 20 minutes, roughly.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much, Eva.
I don't just have the references for anyone who wanted them, but I'm happy to share any of that
Great.
afterwards as well.
Fantastic. Well, there are a couple of questions in the chat from Jiv. So I think why don't you unmute Jiv, and you and Bryony, feel free to jump in, of course, as well. And we can speak, of course, to Eva's presentation first, but then I think there's so many overlaps and threads. So please go for it.
Thanks. I loved that presentation, Eva. And I'm going to hit you up for some more information about that sonic geographies, because I think in my interviews with women, there's a lot of like the baby is squawking or unsettled, or they're speaking directly to the baby, then back to me, and that might be particularly useful for some of my work. But the two questions I put there were, I was interested in how you presented your quotes, the formatting of your quotes there sort of spoke to that sort of interruptive, I guess the sonics of it, and also the thread of consciousness, I guess, and how it sort of stop-start. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to what informed your decision to present your quotes like that.
I think to me, because I didn't have explicit permission, at least at this stage, to share the voice messages, or hadn't talked about that, I wanted to capture some of that interruption, some of the back and forth, some of the ambiguity. So there's no proper strategy to how I presented them, but I kind of was listening to them, and with that, moving the words when I felt like sort of emphasis or breaks. And so to really also ensure that I read them, and I noticed this, the eye has to work to kind of keep up with that. And so I just found it a quite productive way to share how some of those things were felt and expressed by the mothers, and just different emphases and ways of letting the eye move across the slide.
And it's sort of, to me at least, it sort of shows a real attentiveness to what the person is saying, because sometimes it's easy for us to sort of brush over quotes and not sort of be attentive to each words and the intentionality that might be in the words or the way that phrase something. So as a reader as well and a listener, it makes you more attentive to the quote itself. And my other sort of question, just as you were talking particularly about the effective release part of vulnerability, I was thinking, I guess it's like a sort of catharsis. And then I was thinking in terms of, a lot of women experience trauma in birth and early postpartum and sort of acute mental health experiences. And I wonder whether that sort of collective vulnerability that often women find in early postpartum with each other, could there be considered some sort of like trauma bonding associated with that? I don't know if that's something that sort of fits with what you've looked at.
Yeah, I think so. I think one thing that I am really cautious about, and I still writing this up and making sure to attend to this, is, highlighting this power of these actions and the sharing, at the same time realizing the space that I had created with my participants for them to feel safe. So one of the words was a participant saying she always had her phone that she knew she could blast anything into, and I was at the end. And so I had created those spaces in which we did that open, honest sharing, and they felt safe to do so. So really being aware of whose feelings are shared and what kinds of spaces. And again, that notion of if I am a young mother of color with some past record that might have, child welfare services having an eye on me, there's much more precarity in sharing. I'm not coping, motherhood is so hard, which could result in, quite severe actions for that person. And so, yes, thinking of that responsibility that we have to enable this in safe spaces in a way that is productive, and also, pushing from the center out to make this more of the norm, I think is a big responsibility. And I think, so that I do think I don't know if it attends exactly to your question, but I do think there's potential once developed more to ensure this. And I think we know this quite a lot from perinatal mental health, is that there are certainly mothers that need that dedicated psychological postpartum support 100%. But there's as a public health person, I know that there's a whole bunch of people further up the spectrum from that. They need a shoulder to cry on. They need an arm. They need to be heard like, yes, this is exactly my experience. It's not you. And so I think so much of this potential sits in that space for that collective sharing, and the strength that we can collect together through actually saying how it is, and sharing those vulnerabilities.
Thank you.
I had a question for you both about just thinking about how long or fleeting is these moments where you can push back against gendered norms of how you should embody your subjectivity as a mother, or as a sexual subject in the bedroom with your child. Like, there are these, like in both your presentations, your participants were harnessing in moments this great strength and pushing back against, I'm allowed to talk about this, and the more we talk about it, the more normal it becomes. But then, do you think that there's like a time limit on these things, and eventually social pressures push back down? And I wondered, just wondering what you thought about that sort of notion of tabooness, and
I think
I've talked a lot, so you can go first.
I think certainly a lot of these, I mean, what all three of us spoke about, as with a lot of motherhood, take place in the private sphere. And so a lot of women, and certainly in my participants, feel more capacity to push back, as you sort of word it, and carve out new possibilities for expressions of gender and sexuality and intimacy, vulnerability, in those private spaces where they do feel safe, and that they might have the opportunity to explore and play and queer. And yet I think sometimes when they re-enter a more public space, those parts necessarily quieten and maybe become a little bit more reclusive. And so I think in terms of my topic and my interest area, women don't want to be seen as sexual mothers by others, but they may want to be seen as sexual and a mother in their home. And so I think they're happy to play and push against some of those norms and expectations in the private sphere, which as new mothers, they have ready access to, many of them, most of them. And yet when it comes to more public, the more public sphere, they certainly do not want to be seen in that way or express it in that way. And I'm not sure where the tension comes to at that point. Like, I'm not sure when the outside starts enforcing itself in again. I mean, we just don't have that data, unfortunately. But I think it's an interesting question. Like, when do they stop being able to push against? Or do they at all? Maybe they don't. Maybe it does extend outwards.
Yeah, those external emotions being, or like you say, Eva, as external emotions being placed on their identities versus like how they might feel, and give your participants saying, them reflecting on thinking what their partner's thinking about them, like that sort of like they might feel comfortable in their new bodies and feel that strength, but also feel like, oh, but I don't, people might see me in a different way now that's not
Although
sexy.
interestingly, a lot of them say, I actually don't give a fuck what other people think.
Yeah.
Which is new for me. I used to care,
Yeah.
and now I don't really care. And so I think maybe the outside influence actually has less influence,
Yeah.
because they're sort of newly focused on you know, their subjectivity as mother and new roles, and they're once focused on their body, or maintaining a particular type of body, or maintaining a particular type of desirability, is not as important now, perhaps, as it was before for many of them. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry, Eva, I'm not sure what you.
I was just thinking, one thing I was wondering about with your participants. I guess if I think about me, like, that's the last thing sometimes you want to think about, and certainly that broadening of sexual subjectivity is really interesting. But I guess it also really would depend on the partner's desires and the way they treat you postpartum in that time, as to how you feel, because you really embody so much of how your partner treats you. So I'm assuming that played a big role in how the variation of how they felt as well.
Hugely. And, you know, division of labor is just such an important point for a lot of women in postpartum. And division of care responsibilities.
Resentment.
Yeah. But also, you know, in terms of sexuality, how flexible them and their partner can be to having sex and finding intimacy and connection and eroticism in new ways, when the body changes, when temporality changes, when availability changes, when the spaces and objects that you have at your disposal change. How flexible can we be, and how resilient can our sexual intimate relationship be to adapt to that? And yeah, it's certainly, my participants speak to that as well. And the flexibility and adaptability of the partner and the self are really central to how they can maintain some sort of sexual connection. Yeah.
I'm sorry to jump in. We are at time, but I want to ask this last question from Anne, and so we won't get to yours, Steve, sorry. But just, this is probably too much to fit in, but if you could, each of you maybe comment briefly on Anne's question, which is wondering how each of you, as being in the position of parents, experience being on the receiving end of these stories, and you know, how obviously you're reflexively engaged and entangled in your research in different ways depending on your project. So how you navigated this, particularly if they're sharing intimate or different experiences where, you know, you have to shift to a witness sort of insider role. So yeah, how do you do this and hold these stories rather than share your own, or maybe you have to mediate between both? So if you could each briefly answer that, maybe. Do you want to go first, Bryony?
Sure. I love exploring creative methods as a way of looking at my relationship with the participants or the data, and looking at it from new perspectives and angles, and and the sensitivity of it, and how to present people's words in ways that protect their privacy, as well as sharing the vulnerabilities or the nuances or the contradictions of the topic that they're talking about. So yeah, creative methods, and bringing in autoethnography and things like that. Yeah.
Jiv, do you want to answer next?
Sure. I think it's not unfamiliar to me, being a therapist and having been in private practice for quite a long time, that hearing people's intimate, vulnerable stories and being able to sort of maintain the therapist self, or the researcher self in this situation, is, I find, relatively easy, although often these were particularly intimate exchanges, and I have kept quite a big and messy research diary that I reflect on every interview and every exchange with participants, just in terms of what it evokes in me. And I'm certainly trying to write that up as part of my thesis, because I think you know, it's important that we don't discount our own researcher presence in the process and what impact we have on the data itself and on the environment that the research takes place in and everything. We cannot separate ourselves from the process. So I'm trying to weave that into my findings, that I'm not a passive sort of soulless vessel for people to dump their stories on, that you know, it has a ricochet within me as well. So trying to keep research diaries. But the biggest challenge for me was really holding back my therapist self from trying to sort of help them navigate things. So rather than feeling that my personal self was coming out, it was navigating the therapist self, and keeping that at bay was the challenge for me in a lot of these interviews. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a little bit project and method dependent. I mean, for this particular one where I had the diaries with them and was really embedded in their everyday life, I actually wrote a whole paper on using digital diaries that's already published around different notions of those entanglements, of that real diffraction and the way in which their experiences shape mine in return. And I think digital diaries offered a real affordances in that way. I think part of it is sharing and doing some of that comforting of like, oh yeah, I know those sleepless nights, like why do babies never sleep, to just doing some heart reactions to things they're sharing. So I think it's a space you test out, and I felt like also each participant needed something slightly different, and it's especially not, you know, we're in motherhood, we don't dish out advice left, right and center, because we know you know that's not the space that we want to ever be in, but it's about developing that careful listening and affirming, and when at times it feels like some support is needed, saying, hey, I know of this free breastfeeding clinic that operates every Tuesday morning, you know, if you needed support, like, yeah, offering things like that. An occasion I had popped by to hold baby when there was very little sleep. So it's I don't think you can do this kind of research as a bit of a positivist researcher that thinks those two things need to stay very separate, but I think you develop that through the encounters of your particular project and remain really aware of that and listen very deeply to participants and see what their needs are, because of course there is a responsibility when you're working with them in those kinds of spaces. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much to all three of you for wonderful research you're doing, and it was great to have a conversation between you. I'm sure they will continue. I hope they do outside of this. So thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks for the questions from the audience as well. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, just so Steve can press stop.